continuing our tour series of the San Andreas Fault. This time, we're going to take you on a virtual tour of a major parallel fault called the San Jacinto. As pointed out on our tour of the San Andreas through San Bernardino, the San Jacinto is just as active and has had more recent earthquake events. If you haven't watched our other tours of the San Andreas Fault through Wrightwood in San Bernardino in Southern California, you might want to watch those first. We discuss terminology and geologic features commonly found along large faults, such as sag ponds and shutter ridges, and on this tour, we'll be using that same terminology. The San Jacinto Fault, officially called the San Jacinto Fault Zone, is a complex collection of major fault strands that make up an obvious mark or line on the Earth's surface. It's about 170 miles, or 280 kilometers, long. This zone stretches from the Cajon Pass, just northeast of San Bernardino, all the way into Mexicali, Mexico. A quick review from the other videos at a plate tectonic level. The San Andreas Fault is the boundary separating the North American and Pacific plates. Along faults making up this boundary, the North American plate is sliding southeast, whereas the Pacific is sliding northwest. From the Cajon Pass to Mexicali, the San Jacinto Fault is affected by the movements or release of pressure due to these two plates, similar to the San Andreas. That movement means that the potential for large earthquakes along the San Jacinto is just the same as the San Andreas. We became interested in studying fault systems like the San Andreas and San Jacinto because of how these faults influence the landscapes that we see today in Southern California. If you know what you're looking at, the evidence is everywhere. In this video, we'll point out that evidence so that you can go see and discover it for yourself. By the way, that evidence isn't limited to just the San Andreas Fault. You can also see it where other major faults exist, such as in Death Valley, which was created by a fault that behaves similar to the San Andreas. Or in Utah, where this fault, the Hurricane Fault, behaves differently than the San Andreas and partially created the Colorado Plateau, a large region that covers a good portion of 4 states. So, the next time you're sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic on Interstates 10 or 15, take a deep breath, look at the mountains and landscapes around you, and think about some of the concepts we'll cover in this video. Just don't run into the vehicle in front of you! Before we get started explaining the geography, we'd like to first address some of the comments from previous videos where people have differences of opinion on the pronunciation of place names. For the record, we have lived within 100 miles of Mount San Jacinto for more than 50 years, and in all that time, the way I'm pronouncing it is what we've heard most of the time. You may pronounce it as you like. This is just the way we learned it. We've heard people pronounce it San Jacinto and San Jacinto. Basically, it's tomato or tomato, data or data. Say or hear it however you'd like, but I'll be saying San Jacinto. This video is about explaining and showing where ground features exist along the San Jacinto Fault. If you'd like to leave comments about the video, have any questions, or want to share your knowledge of the fault, we'd love to hear from you. But please don't use the comments section to discuss the rules of pronunciation. Also, please remember that we are not geologists. We are not experts on the science or mechanics behind plate tectonics or fault movements. Our major interest is going out to admire the scenery of the Southwest and trying to deconstruct the pieces of a big puzzle that initially put this landscape together. Being able to identify where the major faults are located is a great way to see the assembled puzzle. Unlike our other virtual tours of the fault, With this tour, we're not going to give exact driving directions. As mentioned, we're covering the entire length of the San Jacinto Fault, which is 170 miles long. It crosses many regions, separated by several mountain ranges that you must drive long distances to get around. Instead, we'll point out where various place names and aerial images from the video are on the map. That way, you can get to them yourself by looking them up on your navigation app, such as Google Maps. For a list of all those place names, just like our other videos, go to our website at backroadswest.com. Select the blog option, then search for San Jacinto. On that webpage, you'll find a list of all the places we'll visit on this tour, along with other resources for you to learn more about the fault. One more thing we'd like to say is that this video is not meant to alarm or scare people about earthquakes. Potential earthquakes are simply a fact of life if you live in Southern California. In general, anyone living there should already know about and be prepared for any type of disaster, especially earthquakes. If an earthquake occurred anywhere along the San Andreas, San Jacinto, or any other ancillary fault, the destructive shaking would affect everything in a 20 to 50 mile radius, depending on the type of soil you're standing on. Solid rock naturally won't shake as much, whereas alluvium-filled basins and valleys, where most of the flat land that humans have developed buildings on for over the past 150 years, is much more susceptible to shaking. Other effects of earthquakes include the liquefaction of the ground, which again depends on local soils. As I mentioned earlier, the San Jacinto is closely related to the San Andreas. It's basically a branch of the San Andreas, as are others, like the Elsinore/Whittier and Inglewood faults. All these faults run parallel to the San Andreas, but do not touch or intersect it. They're all right lateral strike-slip faults, and most likely share the energy and pressure buildup from the North American and Pacific plates sliding past each other. Incidentally, the Bay Area has similarly related faults to the San Andreas, just like the LA area. Looking at this aerial view of the Bay Area, you can see the San Andreas here, the Hayward Fault here on the other side of the bay, and the Calaveras Fault, which is further east. You can clearly see how the strike-slip action of both the San Andreas and Hayward faults actually created the San Francisco Bay by spreading apart the land between the San Andreas and Hayward faults, making a depression for water to flow into. The reason that I'm showing you this is many of the landscapes you'll see created by the San Jacinto was created very similarly. For example, the valley that Hemet sits in was created by the spreading or stretching action between the two strands of the fault, whereas the hills in Badlands, here, were created by two land masses being compressed together by action between the San Jacinto and San Andreas faults. See our virtual video tour of the San Andreas Fault through the San Francisco Bay, and you'll learn more about how the landscapes there were created. As you'll see on this map, the San Jacinto sort of parallels the San Andreas. It's closer at its northern end, just 3 miles apart at the bottom of the Cajon Pass, whereas at its southern end, it's 25 miles apart between the town of Anza and Coachella Valley. Geologists believe that the San Andreas is stuck, or plugged, so to speak, near San Gorgonio Pass, causing pressure buildup between both plates to be relieved in other places. Because of this, the San Jacinto formed more recently. Geologists believe the San Andreas formed 20 to 30 million years ago, and perhaps earlier, whereas the San Jacinto formed when the San Andreas got stuck about 1 to 2 million years ago. Now, let me summarize the path of the San Jacinto and quickly show all the places we're going to visit. Again, keep in mind that the San Jacinto is a fault zone. This means that there are various fractures or strands that geologists have identified as being basically part of the same fault. In some places along the fault, it's just a single line or fracture. But at other places, 2 or more fractures may be a quarter mile or up to 3 miles apart, such as near Hemet. In some places, the fault splits into 2 strands, where one fades out. This is evident in the southern section of the fault zone near the Anza-Borrego Desert in Mexicali. Sometimes, strands like these are named 2 different faults by geologists, although they are still related to or part of the San Jacinto Fault Zone. Alright, let's start the summary with this aerial view of Southern California and point out some major place names. The yellow line marks the San Jacinto Fault Zone. Here's the Cajon Pass, Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside, and Hemet. We'll scroll the map down southeast. Here's the town of Anza. This is the portion of Anza-Borrego Desert State Park the fault passes through. Here's the Salton Sea, and finally, Mexicali. And, zooming out, here's the Gulf of California. Our tour begins near the Cajon Pass, which is the separation between the San Bernardino and San Gabriel Mountains. The Cajon Pass was literally created by the San Andreas Fault. The San Jacinto crosses I-15 near the Glen Helen exit and heads southeast towards San Bernardino. At this point, it is located underneath a large wash created by Lytle Creek that extends into southern San Bernardino. In San Bernardino, we'll look at different places the fault passes underneath, as well as several ground features marking the path of the fault. Then, we'll look at where the fault famously bisects the I-10 and I-215 freeway intersection and then crosses the town of Loma Linda. Next, we'll try to follow the fault zone as it passes through neighborhoods of Loma Linda and across the hills east of Ricci Canyon and along some very distinctive hills simply called the Badlands. We'll follow the fault along the eastern edge of a valley, holding the fault's name, the San Jacinto Valley, and through the suburban area called Hemet. At this point, along with creating the eastern border of the San Jacinto Valley, the fault also caused the western border of a well-known mountain range, also of its namesake, the San Jacinto Mountains. Near Hemet, you can clearly see the foothills of these mountains rise up out of the fault zone. The fault then formed straight canyons through the hills south of the San Jacinto Mountains and passes by the town of Anza. South of Anza, the fault splits into 2 strands, the Clark Fault and the Coyote Creek Fault. The Clark Fault fades out near Fonts Point in Anza-Borrego, whereas Coyote Creek continues through Anza-Borrego Desert State Park. Both faults, or essentially the fault zone, is responsible for creating much of the Badlands in the park, mainly the Borrego Badlands. Also in the park, it passes by Borrego Mountain, the site of the last big earthquake on the San Jacinto Fault Zone. Close by is the Salton Sea. This low area was formed by the pull-apart action of the San Andreas and related fault strands, possibly including the San Jacinto. Incidentally, the San Andreas Fault basically ends at the Salton Sea. However, all of the fault strands from both the San Andreas and the San Jacinto zones, basically the overall plate boundary, continues to the southeast and forms what we know as the Gulf of California, separating the Baja Peninsula from mainland Mexico. Alright, time to start the actual tour. We'll start at the fault's northern end, where it comes out of the San Gabriel Mountains and crosses the I-15 freeway. North of the freeway, where the fault exits the mountains, you can see where the fault created this low spot, then this small valley. Looking the other direction, this is a view of where the fault begins to cross the San Bernardino Valley. We'll visit where the fault goes near this neighborhood in a moment. Here's an aerial view looking southeast again and panning to the north. In the distance, you can see the San Bernardino Mountains with the San Andreas Fault at their base, which is only 2.5 miles away from this point. Remember that from this point forward in the tour, both faults will continually get further and further apart from each other. We'll now get closer to this neighborhood and look for any traces of the fault in the hills nearby. Walking out of the neighborhood on this short street, we can get a really close view of the fault. This might be a fault scarp. Panning to the left, you can see the fault by the division of the hills in the flat area. And now we can see the spot where we started next to I-15. We'll now jump down to where the 210 freeway crosses over Lytle Creek, which the fault zone is underneath. Using this aerial image, I'll point out a few distant peaks. This is San Jacinto Peak, highest point in the San Jacinto Mountains. This is Mount San Gorgonio, the highest mountain in Southern California. Just to the left is San Bernardino Peak, which looks higher than San Gorgonio, but it's not. As we pan to the left, we see the full span of the San Bernardino Mountains. The San Andreas pretty much hugs the southern base of these mountains. Now we're looking towards where we began our tour, here. Here is the Cajon Pass in Devore. You can see the large drainage of Lytle Creek, which basically follows the fault zone. And taking advantage of this 360-degree image, here's what the rest of the valley looks like, all the way back to looking back at San Jacinto Peak, most of it built on an alluvial plain. All right, let's move on down the fault to the neighborhood near San Bernardino Valley College. Take a look at this map. See how the streets trend the normal north, south, east, west direction? Then look at the walkways in the college. They're angled differently. Why would that be? Here's why. Let me turn on the geology layer in Gaia GPS. Several years ago, the campus was reconfigured and the buildings removed so that they were not sitting on the fault. Here's an aerial view of the area near the campus. Looking southeast down the fault, you can see this mound that East Grant Avenue crosses. We'll follow this mound in a minute. Panning to the left, again we see the San Bernardino Mountains. We then end up facing back this direction with a walkway pointing in the direction of where we started, here, with a Cajon Pass, here. This is a great example of how almost straight the fault is. Pretty cool, huh? You can easily stroll down this walkway on the campus and see how new knowledge of the fault has influenced its layout. Incidentally, just north of the campus, where Mill Street crosses many railroad tracks over a bridge, the fault passes nearby, which is where Metrolink, Southern California's regional rail service, stores many of its trains. Across Mill Street, this is the view looking back to where we started our tour. Here's that low spot in the ridgeline we saw next to Interstate 15, created by the fault. Continuing southeast from the campus a short distance, we'll follow that mound. Incidentally, this mound is called Bunker Hill on the map. This is a shutter ridge created by the fault and is followed by the now concreted in Lytle Creek. This shutter ridge can be seen on some of the side streets. Where Colton Avenue crosses the fault and Lytle Creek, this church sits on top of this shutter ridge. From the church, looking again to the southeast, you can kind of guess where the fault heads to. Basically, it's heading to the freeway intersection I mentioned earlier. We're now on Auto Plaza Drive, just southwest of the 215, And here's a view looking back at the church on the Shutter Ridge. Looking 180 degrees the other way, we see the freeway interchange ahead. This is the view of Fairway Drive going underneath the 215. The map shows the fault crossing the 215 at this point. Now we'll study the Interstate 10 and 215 freeway intersection. On the map, you can see the fault doesn't exactly go through the intersection, but it passes 1,000 feet or 300 meters to the northeast. Thanks to Google Earth, here's a 3D rendition of the intersection looking southeast. The yellow line shows the fault. Here's the church on our previous stop. Rotating the view around, you can see how big this freeway intersection is with all its bridges. In the late 1960s, when this intersection was being designed, the concept of plate tectonics was new. Geologists knew where the San Jacinto Fault was located, which was very close to the proposed intersection, but they didn't know the relationship yet to the San Andreas. Geologists warned the highway department about the potential of this significant fault, but they were ignored. After the intersection was built, and the facts came out about the now understood plate boundary, several people at the highway department were in the hot seat for ignoring the warnings. Regardless of where the intersection was built, however, it would be damaged during an earthquake, whether it was on top of the fault or 10 miles away, as later earthquakes have proven. We're now looking back at where we came from. Here's Auto Plaza Drive and the church. We'll now walk on the bike path at the western end of Hospitality Lane and E Street to get a good look at the scene underneath the freeway intersection. About 15 years ago, these bridges were retrofitted and given more strength to withstand an earthquake. Here, you can see this additional pillar that was added during the retrofit. We're now going to jump to a neighborhood behind Ricci Canyon Elementary School, which gives us the closest access to the fault as it slices through the hills along Ricci Canyon. Here, looking southeast, you can see these deep cuts in the hills that were most likely caused by movement along the fault as the hills were being uplifted. Looking the other direction, we can see where the fault goes through the Montecito Memorial Park and heads across neighborhoods in Loma Linda and to the Interstate 10 and 215 freeway intersection. From here, the fault continues its path through these hills. We've tried to get close to the fault, but all the roads that go near it are behind a locked gate. The fault created the eastern end of Moreno Valley. On the other side of the fault are these sharply eroded hills, labeled on the map simply as the Badlands. They're also called the San Timoteo Badlands. These badlands were created by the land being crumpled due to the fault compressing and pushing up the land. Then years of erosion created the sharply carved grooves in the pushed-up hills. This same exact process will be seen again on this tour at the Borrego Badlands, which were created the same way as here. Thanks to the San Jacinto Fault pushing up these badlands, fossils of mastodons, ground sloths, and a three-toed horse have been recovered here. They were buried a few million years ago before the fault existed, then pushed up through the fault action about 2 million years ago. You can get a good view of the Badlands being bordered by the fault near Redlands Boulevard and Locust Avenue, and even closer from the northern end of Quincy Street. This aerial 180-degree view shows the Badlands looking from southeast to northwest from the end of Quincy Street. I'm sure you recognize San Jacinto Peak here in the distance. As we pan to the left, the fault is at the border between the flat ground and the Badlands. Now we're looking northwest in the direction we came from. The fault is the line that separates the Badlands from the dark area to the left. We'll next take Ironwood Avenue and Theodore Street from Redlands Boulevard to get to the 60 freeway. Along this short side road, we'll see two fault features. There are several strands of the fault located here, near where Ironwood turns south and becomes Theodore. On some of the side streets, we can see these shallow depressions, which are signs of the fault. Just before Theodore reaches the 60 freeway, you can see these tanks sitting on a shutter ridge. The main strand of the fault is just to the left. From there, we'll jump on the 60, head east a short distance, and take the next exit, which is Gilman Springs Road. Just after exiting, we'll stop on the right and look at this view. This 180-degree aerial view shows where we're headed into the San Jacinto Valley and later Hemet. In this picture, you can see how the fault is the division between the valley on the right and the foothills of the San Jacinto Mountains on the left. As we pan to the left, we see the Badlands and then the 60 freeway. The large concrete pad is part of the Colorado River aqueduct system. When we stop panning, we'll see the tanks we saw at the previous stop along with the shutter ridge. At this point, we are right on top of the fault. As we head into San Jacinto Valley, the fault splits into two different strands. On the map, they're both labeled as the San Jacinto Fault Zone. Here's our last stop. We'll look at the paths the two strands make into the valley. One makes that division between the valley and the mountains. The other strand goes to the right around the western part of the valley. Since both faults move the same way, like this, the valley was basically created by the pull-apart or stretching action between the two faults, the same way we explained earlier on how the San Francisco Bay was created. The right, or western strand of the San Jacinto Fault continues around Hemet and beyond. The left strand, which created the mountains to the left, fades out as it continues past Hemet. The main fault strand now continues and is noticeable from this long, narrow canyon it created through these mountains. Just before the fault reaches the town of Anza, a sag pond can be seen called Hog Lake. We'll stop here for a moment to do an orbit around Hog Lake and see its placement and orientation with the fault. Thanks to Google Earth, it's easy to see. The narrow trench created by the fault action can easily be made out. As we swing back around to the northwest, we can see San Jacinto Valley in the distance. And, even far into the distance, we can see the Cajon Pass, where our tour started, about 55 miles or 88 kilometers away. Due south of Hog Lake is the town of Anza. Looking back now to the southeast, the direction we're headed, we can see the fault slicing its way towards the Anza-Borrego Desert. But before reaching Anza-Borrego, the fault will split again into two strands, and we'll look closer at that in a moment. The one to the left is the Clark Fault, and the one to the right is the Coyote Creek Fault. Although these names are used locally, geologists now recognize that they are both actually part of the San Jacinto Fault. Continuing southeast, we can see where Highway 371 uses a short segment of the fault's trench to pass through this section of the mountains. This is what that short segment of the trench looks like from the road. After a mile, the road turns left out of the trench. A few miles further along the fault is where the two strands actually separate. The Clark Fault continues into the next valley, creating this large basin known as Clark Dry Lake. This basin is a big geologic feature that can easily be visited in the state park. The Clark Fault then borders the eastern side of the Borrego Badlands and fades away. You can see that the Salton Sea is just on the other side of this mountain. The Coyote Creek Fault goes down a canyon of the same name and skirts the edge of the town of Borrego Springs. Here's a view looking northwest along the Coyote Creek Fault from Henderson Canyon Road. One big attraction in Anza-Borrego Desert State Park is the Borrego Badlands. The best way to see it is from Fonts Point. These badlands are created the same way the San Mateo Badlands are created, by the land being compressed between the pushing actions of both faults. The strand of the Coyote Creek Fault, which we'll just call the San Jacinto Fault, continues its southeastern path across the state park. It passes by Borrego Mountain. Borrego Mountain is an interesting geologic feature to explore. You can see how the past million years of fault action shaped this small mountain range by looking at its sharp ridges. It was here in 1968 that a magnitude 6.6 earthquake occurred directly on the fault. It was the biggest recently recorded earthquake along the entire San Jacinto fault zone. Continuing past Borrego Mountain, the fault is responsible for forming a small mountain called Superstition Mountain that is similar in shape to Borrego Mountain. Here the fault splits again into two more strands as it heads to the Mexican border. The right strand passes the right side of the big city of Mexicali and heads down the center of the Gulf of California. And that wraps up our virtual tour along the entire length of the San Jacinto Fault Zone. We hope the visuals we presented have provided you with a better understanding of how faults like this shaped the landscape we live in, as well as more awareness of this often forgotten but significant fault. Before you leave, please press the subscribe button so you'll be notified the next time we put out another tour. And don't forget to visit our website and blog to learn more about where to go see the places we just showed you on this tour. Scroll down the webpage to see that list of places that can be found on Google Maps, as well as an interactive map. Until our next tour of something completely different, we bid you happy exploring.